We're going to get into variables for this next example. Let's go ahead and create a new scene. We'll go up to File, just do New Scene, and File again and do Save Scene. The scene we want to save we'll place inside of our example scenes. So we'll just call this example2 variables. Click on Save. We want to do the same thing we did before on the scripts. We just want to right click on the scripts folder, do Create, C# script, and we want to call this one example2 variables. When you like the word, you have everything ready, just push enter. Remember, this is going to create the class and place in the name for you right there. Alright, last thing, in your hierarchy, just go to create empty, and then just call this one example2 variables. Now we're going to get there's going to be a repetition going here. The next one we'll do example3, example4. We'll set the scenes up over and over again to try to get into the habit and feeling comfortable with the process. So we have our setup ready. Let's go ahead and take our script, example2 variable. Let's drag it over to the example2 variables here. Now if you notice, if you click on this, you'll see the component added to it. You can double click on example2 variables. It's going to open up the MonoDevelop again for us. Now if you want to be able to browse the selection, for instance, maybe I close this or maybe I close this one. Inside of MonoDevelop you have an option for View Solution. If you click on the View Solution or you click on one of them, what you should get is the options to come up. Oh, looks like it's, there we go. Had to click on a couple extra ones. With this one up, what you should see inside of it, it may start rolled up like this, and you'll see the C# example folder and the scripts and the example2, and you can get to it that way. We'll go ahead and close these. They were loading while we were trying to get the other one to show up. I can make this a little bit tighter here so it's doesn't take up so much room. So just like with our example 1, the basic setup here, it created the two using systems for us. It then created our class, assigned the name to it, and we have it deriving from our mono behavior. And again, we'll talk and discuss more about classes and inheritance and deriving things from when we get to it. Our focus is going to be on the body of it. One of the small things, and this is something that's it's something that just depends on what kind of programmer you are. You have a difference with it. Some programmers like to start their curly Q at the end of their line. Some people like to start it at the bottom. Personally, I like to start it at the bottom so that when I click on it, I can see the line up and down with it. Sometimes you can do a show line connections and it'll show it through. What we want to do with this example is just go through some of the variables available to us. These are going to be the most common ones. We'll have additional ones we'll look at in further videos, but these are going to be the ones you find yourself using the most. What I like to do on this one, sometimes I like to use these, but usually, especially for training purposes, is start fresh. That way you're comfortable typing the same words over and over again. You start setting them into memory. First thing we want to do is just go ahead and create a set of variable type. Now, variable is going to be the simplest definition of an object or an element or a field that you're trying to describe. So for instance, a player might have health, movement speed, might have lives, might have any number, maybe a name, general height. You want to place in those as variables. As variable type, we want to say what type they are. Well, the type that we looked at before was string. Now, a string, we could say is, we'll go ahead and just put this one and call it player name. So if you remember, with a type, you do lowercase to start with, and then the second word we have a capital. Now we're going to say it equals, and what does it equal? Well, for a string, it's going to equal some form of letters or numbers in between quotation marks. So I could say this is player name. You could even leave it empty if we wanted. We can say player, not just the name, let's say how much health does the player have. Well, to define health, let's do a player health has an integer. An integer is whole numbers, so it's not a fraction. Integer is defined with an int, and we could say player health. And player health, if we were playing a game, many times games start off with 100 health for player. And then another type that we could use is float. Float is going to be a fraction, a decimal. So if you use the word float, we could say player, and instead of a property directly on it, we could say how fast he moves, so we could say speed. So player speed is going to be a float, and we'll say that he can move about 5.0 miles an hour. Now if you notice, whenever you define a float type, the value at the end has to have f. It can be a lowercase or a capital. Either one is acceptable. Right. So we have a string, we have an int, we have a float, and the last one we could have is a bool or a boolean. The define for this one is going to be bool, and what we want to say, for instance, with this one is maybe we want to do more of a question is dead, and we'll say false. So then we can check for is the player dead or is the player alive. Maybe he's lost all his health, so he goes into a state that says true. Now if you notice, the bool is going to look for a true or false. The float needs to have a decimal point. I can do this, which is fine, but for a define in code, usually you want to have it where you see this so you know that it is a float. Some people like to put like an F at the end, or an underscore and an F. Things that kind of define it, they like to put an I at the end or a B to help you see it. Now those are the basic type. Now just as a standard for any variables you declare, if I am declaring them in a global scope outside of a method, then I can actually declare them as public or private. Public for accessing means that you can actually get this from somewhere else, meaning somewhere else in code, somewhere else in another file, somewhere inside the inspector. So for instance, if I say public string name player, and I do public player health, but for these two I leave them like this. So before we go back into Unity, take a guess at what's going to happen. So if you remember from our debug, we had that string we placed in. So if I have public and then just float and bool, now if I go back into Unity, what I should see when I click on example 2, we're going to see something over here, example 2, and you'll notice player name, and then player health is 100, but the other two don't show up. The reason for that is that when you have a private variable or an undeclared variable here, then it's going to be automatically private, which means it's not going to show in the inspector. So for instance, if I did the word private, this would be the same thing right here as saying nothing at the end of it. So if I did private or just this, both are the same way. Usually I like to put the actual word at the end of it so that when you're browsing through code, you can see it and know that there's a consistency between the calls. So we could actually say, how about this one? We say public. So I have two publics here, a private and a public. Now this is just kind of going to a little bit extra in terms of what the Unity Inspector side is. Now I'm going to declare this as public, but what if I don't want to show it to the inspector? If you don't want to show it in the inspector, you can do something like this. you can actually, this is going to be an attribute, and we'll look at these in more detail later, but I can do one that's called hide in inspector. I use a bracket right here to start it, and then it's hide in inspector. What this does is actually hides my variable from the inspector. So if I save this and go back into Unity, what you'll find is that we have, once it compiles, we have the exact same thing we had before, which is player name and health, but we do have a public variable, it's just not showing up. So if I was to get rid of my hide in inspector and save it, and then go back into Unity, now what you should be able to do is go ahead and guess is that what you'll find is that it's going to show is dead. It'll have a checkbox here for true or false. Okay, so when you're working with your variables, and these are the main variable types you'll find yourself working with, you're going to find yourself using string, integers, floats, and bools. This is what's going to drive most of your code forward creating your games. So as long as you can get those 4 words down and memorize them, know that the string is just a collection of letters inside of quotes. Your integer is just going to be simply a whole numbers being stored. A float is decimal, and the bool is just a true or false. Alright, so we have those. I'm going to change my private to public. We'll keep all of these public for the moment. Alright. So let's go ahead and do what we've done before, which is we make a method called start, which is what Unity uses. This is going to be what gets initialized, so it's going to run one time at the start of the script. If you remember, we used the debug, so we're just going to call debug log. And this time, we're going to use a little bit of arithmetic inside. We're going to use some addition inside of our log. And we want to print all of these together. Now if you think you already know how to do it, go ahead and try it before you see it, and then see how close you get to it. I'm going to say player name plus, we'll do player health, and then we'll plus player speed, and is dead. If we have all of those and we do a plus, because this returns a string, this is going to put all of these together into one string. So let's go ahead and go back to Unity. Let's check it out real quick. So we should have all 4 of our options over here in the inspector. If we push play, what we should see is it's going to print a string going all the way across. It'll say player name 105 and false. So to finish up on this part, just as seeing the basics of our variables, if we were trying to figure out how to put spaces between these, we can actually add a string of space in between. So we're going to make player name plus string plus the variable. So go ahead and add in this part, and that'll separate out each of the pieces. And if you push save, Control S, or go up to File and Save, what you'll have at this point is a nice separation between your variable type in the console when it gets printed. So if I push play, what you'll notice now is we have a nice little spacing in between each one. Alright, so that's going to be the basic idea of the integer types, string types, float types, and bools. This is what I would consider is just, when it comes to like really an introduction, is just remember what each of these do. We're going to reinforce it by using them. But also remember that anytime you want to see something of these type displayed in the console, you can just debug.log, put it in parentheses, and place them inside of here. Alright, so the next thing we'll do is actually start to use these inside of one of our methods.